Really enjoyed John David's insights that he shares. Really, I think the adult probably got a lot from the connections that he brought out, the story of Jonah and Peter and the scriptures today. But I'm going to choose for us to spend a little time looking at this passage in Revelation. I know Revelation can be an intimidating book in a lot of ways, but it doesn't have to be. It has a marvelous message, but we have to understand that what John is talking about, he's talking about in kind of cosmological, mythological, grand terms that are figurative, rather than talking about things in historical terms. He is talking about what's happening on earth as he writes to the churches of his day who are undergoing persecution. He's talking about what's happening on earth, but he's not talking about it in earthly terms. Instead, in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets, he wants to pull back, as it were, the curtain and to show us what is happening on a grand level, what is truly going on, not in simply earthly terms, but in heavenly terms. And so he chooses this kind of cosmological language, this mythological language that's figurative, that illustrates what he's talking about. And with a little help, we can understand. So I want to do two things. I want to look at these verses from Revelation 21, 1 through 6, to see a little bit of how the language portrays something, but then also to think about, what does this mean? What does it mean for us to hear the prophecy of John? Now, prophecy doesn't mean he's all about telling the future. It really means more often that he's interpreting the present and trends, right? I mean, the prophets would talk about things that were going to happen, but often it was like, the way things are trending, here's what is going to transpire. Not so much like saying, on a certain date, far, far in the future, X will happen. I mean, rarely did they do that. More often, they just proclaimed the truth, the reality about this earth and what God is doing. So the passage begins, Revelation 21. Obviously, we're at the end of the whole book. So here we are toward the end. And it starts off verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. So he contrasts a kind of vision of this temporary world, this heaven and earth, what we know, what we live in and experience day by day. And he says that passed away. That is passing away. It is passing away because it is old. It is decaying. It is not substantial enough to last. But instead, what John sees is how this world is being replaced with a new heaven and new earth. Now, the reference to why there is no longer any sea, this is, you say, what's that about? Well, think back to Genesis. In the beginning, the Spirit of God moves over the face of the waters. The way it is pictured in Genesis is there's just water. And water represents a kind of chaos, a kind of, turbulence. So even stories like Jesus calming the storm when the disciples are in the boat has a kind of meaning beyond simply, oh, there was a weather event, because it means something. And often in like the Psalms, the waters are used as language about troubles or uncertainty. So in Genesis, there's this water out of which God then brings the dry land. He creates order. He calms the water. Then also in the book of Revelation, the sea has appeared earlier. And I'm going to read you one little verse from chapter 13 about the sea in terms of what it means in John's vision. So 13 verse 1, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore, the dragon representing the devil, the satanic force that is behind the corruption of this world. And again, you got to remember, John is saying, if we pull back the curtains, what is going on? Well, Satan is trying to corrupt God's good world. And we, as those who are trying to follow Christ, we as Christians are suffering in this circumstance of persecution. He says, what's going on? Well, the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads were blasphemous names. Well, the beast here that comes out of the sea is representative of the Empire of Rome. Rome, the city, sat on 7 hills. And the horns here, a symbol of strength or power, represent the kings. And there are 10 different kings. And so the Jews, the readers of John's day, would have understood this kind of picture. They would have understood, not that, this is strange and weird and sounds like science fiction. They would say, I get the imagery. The image of a beast, of a monster that is threatening us. And so what John is saying in chapter 13, well, the devil has called up the Empire of Rome, and it's a city built on 7 hills. So there are 7 heads, and there are 10 horns. There have been 10 Caesars, and those horns wear crowns. They're the kings. They have blasphemous names because the big problem is Caesar wants to be called Lord. What is required of Roman citizens is that they agree that Caesar is Lord. And the Christians have a problem with that because they say, no, Caesar is not Lord. Jesus is Lord. And that's getting them in trouble. That's the source of their persecution. So the sea has been the place from which evil has come in the story, in this vision that John is relating in Revelation. So just like it's the primordial sea out of which God brings order, calms the waters, separates them, and creates dry land in the very beginning, now it's as if the sea again is our problem. And out of it comes this beast. But in the picture of the new heavens and new earth, John said quite comfortingly, there is no longer any sea. There's no longer a source for evil, for what perpetuates our struggle, our difficulties, our suffering. The sea has disappeared. Another way this is presented in chapter 4 of Revelation, after the 7 letters to the churches, chapter 4 gives us this picture of a throne room. And people from all nations are gathered around the throne. They're all worshiping. The elders are there. And sometimes we'll sing it in a song. They're casting down their crowns before the crystal sea. And what's that about? Well, before the throne in Revelation 4, the sea is like glass, like crystal. And again, what's the imagery? It has been so stilled, so calmed, that you don't even see a ripple. You would think it is solid crystal and not actually water. So with these images that John's contemporaries would understand, where the sea is this metaphor for the source of evil, of trouble, of tumult, of suffering, it's where that comes from. Before the throne of God, it's calm. And in the new heavens and new earth, in fact, it has disappeared. That's the kind of message he's relaying. So the first heaven and first earth have passed away, and a new one has come in its place. Then there's a second image in verse 2, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So the first image is a new heavens and new earth. The second image is Jerusalem, but now not earthly Jerusalem, but a true, holy, new Jerusalem. The word new is showing up here quite a lot, isn't it? Right? The old Jerusalem is still part of the old heavens and earth. But here comes from heaven itself a new Jerusalem, and it is described as a bride adorned for her husband. The husband is Christ himself, the bridegroom. The bride is the church. New Jerusalem here is a picture of the church, made ready for her husband. John says, where is everything heading? We're headed towards a wedding. The end is a wedding. The end is a marriage of God to his people. The end is the feast of a wedding. That's where things are headed. And so that's the picture in verse 2. The people of God as New Jerusalem, as a bride made ready for her husband. Then in verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne. And the question is, well, who's on the throne? Some people will say, well, it's God the Father. But often here in Revelation, the one on the throne is talked about as the Lamb who appears as slain. So the image that John keeps bringing up is of Christ, the one crucified who is on the throne. And so I prefer to read this as Christ. I heard a loud voice from the throne. In other words, Christ saying, behold, the dwelling of God is among people, and he will dwell among his people, and they will be his people, and God himself will be among them. I mean, this is reminiscent of God's words to Israel when they came out of Egypt and they went to Mount Sinai. And if you read in Exodus 19, as they get to the mountain, God says, if you will keep this covenant, I will be your God and you will be my people. And so once again, you have to read John as an Old Testament prophet in Revelation. He's grabbing these images from the Old Testament and he's saying, see, the situation where we are the people of God and we're in this covenant relationship and he is our God, that is what has transpired, what has come about. And in this circumstance, in verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things being the things of the heavens and earth that are passed away. Those first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne verse 5, and he who sits on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. So think for a moment, this grand picture, right? There's a new heavens and a new earth. There's a new Jerusalem. There's God making all things new. There's God dwelling with his people. All of these things is what John portrays. Now, how do we think about this for ourselves? I think what we can gain from this kind of message is that John wants to cultivate in us a kind of what I would call prophetic imagination or prophetic perspective. That John would say, through all these images, through pulling up these references to things from the Old Testament prophet, because if you read Ezekiel, you'll see the same sort of language and imagery. You'll see beasts and monsters and struggles. What John is saying is we need to find ourselves within this kind of grand story, and that our place is such that we recognize that God is making all things new. I mean, I looked at it very specifically in verse 5. It's present tense. It's not I will make. It's not that I already have made. It's I am making all things new. Now, I wish it was I have made all things new and we were already on the other side of it. But that's not where we are. But it's not also that I will make, like, oh, just put up with it. Someday things will be different. But it seems to me it's more like Jesus' prayer that he gives his disciples about praying that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. that it's an ongoing process and we find ourselves in the midst of it. Part of the message is, but you need to understand what is happening, is what John is saying to the church. You need to understand what is happening. There's a grand struggle here between light and darkness, between good and evil, between the goodness of God and the attempts of Satan to subvert it. And sometimes we get caught up in the suffering of that struggle. But we need to remember where to place our confidence. Amen. To those Christians who were suffering under Rome, Rome looked like a completely indomitable power. I mean, it was the empire of its day. It ruled from Spain over to the east, far into the east, and North Africa and Europe. I mean, it was this massive empire. And its army was invincible. Its legions marched around and kept the Roman peace. It would be easy to think, oh, salvation will be found in Rome. But John says very distinctly, oh, Rome is part of a passing away order. It's a part of a heavens and earth that is going to pass away. And instead is coming the new ways of God to be established in the world. And we as a people of God are in this covenant relationship with God as his people by grace to participate in this new thing that he is bringing, that he is doing. So for me, when I think about this, I hope to remember that whatever's going on in our world is an evidence of its decay and how it will not last. And not to put our confidence in the things of this world, but to put our confidence in what God is doing in this world, because there is a newness that is always blossoming. And I like the way the lectionary text chose the passage from John 13, a new commandment I give to you. So you've got the new command of John 13, and now John saying, oh, I'm doing a new thing. What do you think the new thing is in Revelation 21? It doesn't say what it is. It just says, behold, I'm making all things new. I'm doing this new thing. How are you doing that, Lord? Maybe it's through the new command of love one another just as I have loved you. Maybe the newness of that command and the making all things new are related. And so what I have to remember is, though Rome's legions look invincible and its power seems unmatched, and how in the world can we continue on with our little works of love in the face of such might? That's how the new earth and the new heaven comes about. That's where God is working. These other things will fade away. I think in every age, Christians have needed to keep this vision in mind. Some times are easier than others. We do not live in the worst of times in which to live as Christians. But every time also has its struggle, which is why this book speaks to us still. When we encounter the struggle, when we encounter the injustice, when we encounter the brokenness, we are reminded by John, oh, but this heaven and this earth will pass away. And another is coming, that which God is creating. And remember, he told us, love one another. I believe when we do that, we participate in this new world.